Keira Lane and Daniel Reeves were the couple everyone thought had it all. She, a rising model with a dangerous edge. He, a gifted photographer capturing her every move, but behind the lens of their picture-perfect life, police say their late-night warehouse shoot ended in a single gunshot that turned ambition into tragedy. On social media, Daniel Reeves and Keira Lane looked like the couple everyone wanted to be. Their feeds were filled with perfectly curated shots, him behind the lens, her in front of it, often in outfits that pushed boundaries and backdrops that made people stop scrolling. Daniel had built a reputation as a young photographer with a talent for capturing raw, gritty scenes. He liked to work with shadows, abandoned streets, and broken places that still had character. Keira, just 23, had the look that turned heads. She was bold, striking, and unafraid of taking risks that other models might hesitate over. Together, they projected an image of creative partners chasing their dreams with relentless energy. To their followers, they seemed unstoppable. Comments flooded in under their posts, calling them the next big thing, art goals, and a power couple. When they showed up at local fashion events or art shows, they walked in hand, smiling for the cameras, playing into the idea that they were both destined for bigger stages. Friends often said they seemed inseparable, moving through life as though one couldn't function without the other. Daniel's work improved with Keira as his muse, and Keira's profile grew thanks to the steady stream of images Daniel produced. To the outside world, they had momentum, ambition, and the kind of chemistry that translated perfectly into art, but behind the lens, away from the curated image, things were different. Those closest to Daniel noticed subtle shifts in him over time. He was more tired, more distracted, often stressing over money and creative blocks. He confided to a few friends that Keira wasn't always easy to work with. She could be demanding, pushing him to keep up with her relentless ideas, no matter how impractical. He admired her confidence, but he also struggled to keep up with it. Keira thrived on attention, and she knew how to get it. If a set wasn't edgy enough, she'd push for something darker, louder, more dramatic. She didn't just want to model, she wanted to shock people, to make them stop and talk about her photos. It wasn't long before her interests began to shift into territory that made Daniel uncomfortable. Props were nothing new in their shoots, but Keira took a liking to weapons, first plastic replicas, then realistic-looking props, and eventually the real thing. Friends recalled scrolling through her feed and noticing the change. What once looked like edgy fashion now looked like obsession. A toy revolver turned into a vintage-looking replica, then into an actual handgun at a shooting range. She posted photos in camouflage, in dark makeup with rifles slung over her shoulder, writing captions about strength and fearlessness. For many, it was just another phase, but Daniel worried it wasn't just for the camera anymore. Despite his concerns, Daniel couldn't pull away. Something about Keira's intensity kept him hooked. He loved her fire, even when it burned to close. And while he sometimes questioned where all of this was leading, he continued to stand by her, lens in hand, ready to capture whatever wild idea she wanted to bring to life next. What no one knew was that beneath the glamorous photos and curated perfection, their relationship was becoming fragile, a mix of love, ambition, and dangerous impulses quietly building toward a breaking point. Keira's fascination with weapons began as a stylistic choice, something that set her apart from other models in the local scene. While most girls posed in floral dresses or urban streetwear, she wanted an edge. Something that would make people remember her photos long after they scrolled past. At first, it was harmless. Plastic swords from costume shops, spray-painted toy pistols, even kitchen knives pulled from drawers became props. Daniel indulged her, thinking it was just another phase of experimentation, a way to stand out in a crowded world of fashion influencers, but over time, the props changed. They stopped being toys and became cold, heavy objects with the weight of reality attached to them. Keira discovered gun ranges and became a regular visitor. She began posting clips of herself practicing, the sharp recoil of each shot accompanied by captions about empowerment and control. Her audience grew, feeding her desire to keep pushing boundaries. The aesthetic of her portfolio shifted entirely. Gone were the soft tones and playful settings. Instead, her images featured leather jackets, military gear, and guns front and center. Some followers praised her boldness, calling her a pioneer. Others quietly unfollowed, disturbed by the escalating obsession. Daniel, however, felt torn. On one hand, her new look got attention, and attention meant more exposure for his photography. On the other hand, he didn't like the direction it was heading. He voiced his worries in small ways, reminding her about safety, questioning whether they really needed real guns for the shoots, but Kira brushed him off. For her, it wasn't just about fashion anymore. It had become part of her identity. She saw herself as untouchable, a woman who could blur the line between beauty and danger. Their relationship, once playful and light, began to change under the weight of her obsession. Arguments became more frequent. Daniel accused her of being reckless, while Kira accused him of holding her back. Friends noticed how tense they seemed at gatherings, how Daniel stayed quiet while Kira dominated conversations, often steering them toward her love of firearms and the projects she planned to shoot with them. What had once been an exciting collaboration now felt like a battle for control. The strain also showed in Daniel's work. His once carefully crafted images became rushed, lacking the subtle artistry he was known for. Some believed he was tired, others thought he was uninspired, but those closest to him suspected the truth. Working with Kira had become exhausting. He didn't want to walk away from her. He loved her, but her growing obsession with weapons made him uneasy. He worried about what might happen if the line between art and reality blurred too far. Meanwhile, Kira only leaned further into her new persona. She relished the attention, the messages from strangers who admired her confidence, the feeling of control that came from holding something powerful in her hands. The gun wasn't just a prop anymore. It was a symbol of who she believed she was becoming. And though Daniel stood beside her, his camera capturing every shot, a quiet dread settled over him. He couldn't shake the feeling that her obsession wasn't just for show, and that sooner or later it would spiral into something neither of them could control. The night of the warehouse shoot had been planned for weeks. Daniel had scouted the location during the day, wandering through the skeletal remains of the old building with his camera slung around his neck. The cracked windows, rusting beams, and spray-painted walls seemed to echo with forgotten stories, making it exactly the kind of backdrop he loved. For Kira, it was perfect to a stage for her newest concept. She wanted to look dangerous, untamed, someone who lived outside the rules. She insisted the handgun would be the centerpiece of the shoot, not just another accessory. That Friday evening, they packed up their gear and drove out just as the city was winding down. The streets grew quieter, and the glow of neon signs faded as they reached the edges of town. The warehouse loomed like a dark monument against the night sky, its broken windows catching the pale light of the moon. Inside, the air was damp and filled with dust. Old machinery stood abandoned, casting long shadows across the floor. It was eerie, but for Kira, it was electric. She thrived on settings that felt raw and unsettling. They set up around midnight, the silence broken only by Daniel's camera clicks and the faint echo of music playing from a speaker they brought along. At first, the session felt like many before it. Daniel gave his full attention to the light, the angles, the way Kira's silhouette looked against the fractured glass panes. She moved with practiced confidence, striking poses that blended beauty with menace. The gun flashed in her hands, polished metal catching the light, transforming her into the character she wanted to project. But as the night wore on, Daniel noticed her mood shifting. She was more restless than usual, less concerned with taking direction and more interested in improvising. She twirled the gun, pointed it toward the ceiling, and held it against her own reflection in a shard of broken glass. At one point, she began pacing, tossing out ideas for shots that were wilder and more chaotic. Daniel, focused on capturing what he could, tried to steady the energy in the room, but he could feel it spiraling. The tension between them rose. He wanted her to stick to the plan, to keep things controlled, while she wanted to push the limits. For Daniel, it was just another shoot, another night to create images that might catch the attention of magazines or agencies. For Kira, it felt like more a performance, an act of defiance, a statement of power. The warehouse, the darkness, the gun in her hand all seemed to feed her energy. Outside, neighbors who lived near the property later told police they noticed strange lights and faint music coming from the building. A few thought it was just teenagers trespassing, playing around in the abandoned space. No one could have guessed that inside, the atmosphere was beginning to tilt from art to danger. Daniel adjusted his camera bag, preparing for another angle, while Kira lifted the weapon once more, her expression unreadable in the dim light. The night was still young, but already it carried the weight of something about to go wrong. What happened inside the warehouse after midnight would later be reconstructed only through fragments of evidence, testimony, and speculation. The facts that could be confirmed were chilling enough. At 12:47 a.m., a single gunshot cut through the silence of the night, echoing across the empty streets and into the neighboring houses. Some residents assumed it was fireworks, others thought it might have been a car backfiring, but one person dialed emergency services to report the sound. Inside the building, Daniel Reeves was on the ground near his equipment bag. He'd been struck in the chest, the bullet tearing through him before he could react. His camera lay only a few feet away, the lens cracked where it had hit the floor. A tripod stood half-assembled, suggesting he had been preparing to adjust the setup when the shot was fired. The careful rhythm of the night, the poses, the flashes, the clicks had ended in sudden chaos. Kira was the one who placed the frantic 911 call. When officers arrived minutes later, they found her pacing the floor, her hands smeared with blood from trying to press against Daniel's wound. She told them it was an accident, that the gun had gone off during the shoot, that she hadn't meant to hurt him. Her words came out in gasps, broken by sobs, but investigators quickly noticed details that didn't line up. The gun lay a few feet from Daniel, loaded with live rounds. It was not a prop, nor a weapon prepared safely for theatrical use. The safety was off. Detectives also observed that Daniel had been struck while bending over his bag, not while standing in a pose or staging a shot. The trajectory suggested he hadn't been facing her, which raised questions about how the firearm had been discharged. If he wasn't part of the scene when the trigger was pulled, what exactly had been happening in those seconds before the shot? The warehouse itself told a fragmented story. A scattering of photo equipment was spread across the dusty floor. Music was still playing faintly from the portable speaker, eerie against the grim silence of the crime scene. Daniel's blood stained the concrete near a patch of graffiti, a vivid reminder of how quickly the night had unraveled. Kira's makeup had streaked down her face, a mixture of sweat, tears, and smeared eyeliner as she sat handcuffed on the steps outside, officers watching closely. In her initial statement, she insisted she hadn't realized the gun was loaded. She said she had brought it only for the sake of the photographs, that she had handled it countless times before without issue. But detectives remembered the way she had spoken about weapons on her social media, the videos of her firing rounds at shooting ranges, the captions celebrating her control and skill. The narrative of a careless accident seemed harder to accept in light of her history. Forensic experts were called in to piece together the sequence. They measured the angle of the bullet, examined fingerprints on the weapon, and photographed every detail of the scene. Each step raised more questions than it answered. The central mystery lingered. Had the trigger been pulled in recklessness, in anger, or with intent? Whatever the truth, Daniel's life had ended on that warehouse floor, and the woman who had once been his muse was now at the center of a homicide investigation. In the days following the shooting, the story spread quickly across news outlets and social media. The narrative of a young model obsessed with guns and the tragic death of her photographer boyfriend captured immediate attention. What shocked people most was how visible the warning signs had been. Posts of Kira with firearms, captions about power and control, and the steady escalation of her obsession had all been in plain sight, yet few had taken them seriously. Now, with Daniel gone, every photo and video was re-examined through a darker lens. Friends and acquaintances began speaking out, painting a picture of a relationship far less glamorous than what appeared online. Several mentioned Kira's temper, recalling arguments that often escalated beyond what seemed normal. Some remembered moments when she had waved a weapon around during heated exchanges, laughing it off later as a joke. Others spoke of Daniel's growing unease, how he had confided that her fixation with guns made him nervous, but that he felt trapped between love and fear. The one Senbid couple was now revealed to be a partnership fraying at its seams long before the final night in the warehouse. Investigators uncovered text messages that became central to the case. In them, Kira repeatedly referenced control, making unsettling comments about holding the upper hand in the relationship. To the prosecution, these messages suggested a pattern, a window into her mindset that went beyond reckless behavior. They argued that the shooting wasn't just an accident, but the result of a volatile personality spiraling out of control. The discovery of her repeated visits to gun ranges, paired with her online persona, only strengthened the argument that she was far from inexperienced with firearms. Her defense team countered with a different story. They described her as a troubled young woman caught up in an image she felt pressured to maintain, someone whose desire to shock and impress had tragically gone too far. They maintained that the gun had discharged by mistake, that Kira had no intention of killing Daniel, and that she was already living with unbearable guilt. They leaned heavily on her tearful 911 call, her desperate attempts to save him, and the shock she displayed when police arrived. To them, she wasn't a murderer, she was careless, reckless, but ultimately broken by a mistake she could never undo. The case divided public opinion. Some saw Kira as dangerous, someone whose obsession with weapons had been allowed to grow unchecked until it claimed a life. Others viewed her as a tragic figure, consumed by an image she created for herself and destroyed by it. Comment sections filled with debates, hashtags spread, and both families were caught in the relentless cycle of media attention. When the charges were officially filed, the weight of the situation became undeniable. Kira stood accused of second-degree murder, a label that carried both legal consequences and a lasting stigma. For Daniel's loved ones, justice meant accountability for the life cut short. For Kira, it meant facing the reality that her pursuit of a shocking persona had led her into a courtroom instead of onto magazine covers. What had begun as an attempt to stand out in the world of art and fashion had ended in tragedy, leaving behind grief, questions, and a reminder of how quickly obsession can turn into catastrophe.